this is a model of a scale model of a B&O C-16, more commonly known as a Little Joe, from all of the basically genericized versions of it that came in model train sets. A lot of people know it as the dockside switcher as well, which certainly fits. That's definitely something the actual C-16s did. What's funny is that it's such a ubiquitous model for sort of starter model railroad kits, but there were actually only 4 of these locomotives, and 2 of them had tenders, so really there were only 2 prototypes that these were based on. They were designed for running on really tight curves and street running and dock running in B&O's domain, and that's actually why there's a chain here. Some of the stuff they're responsible for was pulling box cars out of warehouses on the street, and it was something like a 40 something or maybe 80 something foot radius curve in real life, and you couldn't actually couple the locomotive to the cars, so you had to put a chain and tow it out of there using this chain. This model has power functions. You can see the receiver lens there, and the battery box is here inside the saddle tank, and the M motor is visible underneath right there. It drives these M wheels, so you have to use traction bands or you won't get much pulling power. The front axle is actually the one that's driven. It's an 8-tooth gear on the M motor, driving 2 12s facing each other, and then from the 12 to the 20 here. So total reduction is 8 to 20, so 2 to 5. This is a pretty slow locomotive, and that's reasonable given the prototype. Wheelbase is quite short. That was something that was needed to negotiate the small curves where these locomotives worked in real life. And that's fine. That goes nicely with Lego's tight curves on their track. Main drawback is that the overhang on both sides is pretty big. The front, it's just barely acceptable. We talk about this a little bit in our wheelbase length video. But on the back, this is something like 11 studs. And to deal with that, the entire top body of the locomotive can twist very slightly, and that's just enough to compensate for towing problems. Turn the locomotive over, you can see how that's done. The M motor and this entire powered truck is one unit. Not sure what it's catching on there. And that's, well, held in on this flexible axle, and that's the spring force that centers it. I guess this popped out over time, and that was what I was feeling there. Back is just held on by 2 pins on the power functions receiver. So the receiver is integral, and the battery box is also integral to the construction of this. So all in all, just very compact. So a couple other quirks due to the small size of the prototype and the need to cram all of the power function stuff in here. Definitely this would have been an easier locomotive to make with powered up, which I didn't have at the time. First off, the locomotive is not symmetric. On this side of the locomotive, there's a cutout for a compressor and some other gadgetry. This has actual consequences for operating this model because of that construction, you can only put the power plug for the motor on one side of the receiver, which means this has to operate on a specific channel. It can't be, I forget if it's red or blue, I believe it's blue, but it can't be the other one because of the position of that plug. The other is that because the battery box is integral, to change the batteries I'd have to tear the whole thing apart. And so this is actually where I wound up using my rechargeable battery box. Pulling the steam dome and this plate, which has nothing holding it in, is just captive resting there, exposes the battery box, which then you can run a plug in there and charge it without taking the whole locomotive apart. This also serves as the power switch. Pushing down, you can just barely see that it's lit. Push again, and those are just the boat studs on the bottom, turning it on and off. Right, so these are Big Ben bricks started making medium drivers with an O-ring built in. It's actually pretty deep in there, and this is kind of nice. But before that, we turned these on our own and also added some O-rings we got from McMaster. Again, we didn't cut the groove as deep, and these O-rings are a little bigger, so they're on pretty loosely. But they worked okay. The main difference is basically that this is more convenient and the O-ring's a little lower profile. How big of a difference that makes, it's hard to say.
We modded these parts more than a year ago, but somewhat after Big Ben Bricks started offering them. We wanted to investigate the practicality of modifying our existing wheels versus buying new ones. The latter cost twice as much, and we already had the former. We also wanted to evaluate their performance compared to plain plastic wheels and to our earlier mod, wheels coated with caulk. We measured the hub diameter of the medium drivers and bought some 1 by 22.5 millimeter O-rings from McMaster. Then came the hard part, cutting an appropriate groove. We mounted the wheel on a cross axle and chucked it in a mini mill originally designed for wood. The machine did come with some cutting tools, but not one with the right shape, so we initially tried turning with a screwdriver. Perhaps obviously, that did not go well. The screwdriver simply scuffed the plastic rather than dig into it. Thus, we decided to use an actual tool and risk making a shallower and wider channel than desired. Still, this time it actually cut into the plastic, though the shavings seemed more like dust. Eventually, we made a groove that would hold one of the O-rings, and we repeated the procedure on a second wheel. And now for the test. We used the 360 gram V20 with a single driven axle as our test vehicle. With plain plastic wheels, this configuration pulled 50 grams, reasonable given that it pulls 90 to 100 grams with two driven axles. With the caulked wheels, admittedly pretty worn by now, it pulled about the same amount. With the tired wheels, the tractive effort increases significantly, up to 70 grams. We did not have the equivalent BBB wheels at the time, but we can compare with other tired wheels based on existing train pull data. As usual, linked in the description. Assuming half the weight, 180 grams, rests on the driven axle, plastic wheels give an effective coefficient of friction of 0.25. The tired wheels raise this figure to 0.4, comparable to setups like the BR24 with official rubber bands and the A6B with other O-rings from McMaster. Overall, this worked quite well. The C-16 ran on these wheels for more than a year, and they gave reasonable traction and little trouble. Still, the mod did not prove practical enough to repeat, and we eventually bought the Big Ben Bricks versions anyway, though that makes more sense as part of a larger order. On that note, this is the end of the video. Please consider subscribing if you like what we do, and have a nice day.
Oh, actually, you can barely do 100. Oh, it's sliding.
Oh, it quit. It quit.
Oh,
It quit.
no. Oh,
Yeah, it quit.
what motor is it? Is it old gear
It's
motor?
an M.
Oh. Is there oh.